I'm really excited to be here. I was really excited. Also, Brent is new to me, but as I've heard this morning, you can't say no to Brent, and I definitely fell into that category for this. But I'll tell you, I'm so excited to be here. I think some of the panelists earlier were talking about this, how important it is that we really start to establish a common language among all of us in the community. So thinking about that, not just as us as service providers or people in the helping professions, but everyone in the community, because this is something that will take all of us to work on and be able to understand. The other thing that I'm really excited about is that this information is being integrated into the curriculum here. I can't tell you how exciting that is for me. I was speaking with someone during the break. Last week I had 2 new clients come in, both of them with existing diagnoses, and I'm really feeling a little bit skeptical about if those diagnoses are appropriate or not, as well as the treatment plans that these clients were receiving, because the clinicians who saw them and evaluated them never talked with them about their trauma histories, which for both clients, it's pretty extensive. So I really think that this is an important thing for us to be talking about, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how I came to learn that as we move forward and how you guys ended up getting stuck with me today. But also about some of the things that we're asked often, like what is trauma? What is trauma-informed care? What does it look like? Often I have clinicians ask me, when do I get to consider myself a trauma-informed clinician? So we're going to talk about some of these core competencies of trauma-informed care. And as Wendy said earlier, starting to introduce what this first level of curriculum will look like here. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. But I think I'm also going to have a little bit of time at the end for us to answer some questions as well. But I'm just going to start with the basics. So we're going to cover the why, what, and how of trauma-informed care today. So we're just going to start off with this. First, what is trauma? Right, this is the definition from the American Psychological Association. And it just says trauma is defined as the emotional response someone has to an extremely negative event. While trauma is a normal reaction to a horrible event, the effects can be so severe that they can interfere with an individual's ability to live a normal life. Okay, so when I think about this definition of trauma, there are many out there, but I like this one because I think it starts to illustrate something, at least in how I conceptualize trauma. I think about it in 2 parts. That there's an event, and then there's the response to the event. If someone comes into my office and they say, Kara, I experienced this thing, I went through this, and they're exhibiting all of the symptoms associated with trauma. I'm not as concerned about the event as I am about the symptoms of the event, or the symptoms that are presenting in my office. Does that make sense? Of course, I look at that and say, wow, okay, this thing happened. But I'm really thinking about, okay, how is this presenting or manifesting in this person? So when we think about trauma, or at least when I think about trauma, I think about those two working parts. And how it can impair our functioning, right? So at least we can see some of these impairments in cognitive functioning, physical health, mental health, social skills, occupational skills, emotional health. And the way that we might see these impairments in functioning may vary. And that may change even day to day with someone. I might see someone on Tuesday, and they seem like they're doing okay. See them Thursday, and I might be seeing a number of these different symptoms. So it's a consistent evaluation process. So we're going to talk just a little bit about ACEs, because I think that is a really important part in foundational understanding of trauma. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but I always like to include it in my talks because, again, moving towards that goal of us all being on the same page and having the same level of understanding. So I always like to just include it. And, I've presented this, like Wendy said, over 3,000 people, I think, at this point, about ACEs in the community. And there's always a mixed crowd in how many people know about it, how many people don't. And I think even having presented on it that many times, I still learn something new when I look at the literature too. So just as we go into that, how many people are familiar with ACEs? Oh, good. Good. So a good solid chunk of you. And for those of you who haven't heard about it yet, I'm excited to tell you. So this is how we used to work with people. We used to see, some of these people that we're working with, they have, from our clinical language, they have an adoption of health risk behaviors. And that's leading to disease, disability, and social problems. And then that's leading to early incarceration or death, right? So people are making choices, they're doing bad things that are risky, and then that's causing them problems, and then they're ending up in jail or dead, right? That's what we used to see when we worked with people, right? So I'm just curious if we can throw out some examples of health risk behaviors. What would we put on that bottom level? Smoking, drug use, yeah. Sure, prostitution, yeah. Okay, self-harm. Good. I hear some other stuff going, and this is the thing, is social workers often, at least in my work, I've seen a lot of what would qualify as health risk behaviors, right? We're working in these service organizations, so they're present. But what the ACEs study really allowed us to do is start to shift our framework a little bit so that we can understand if there's a way that we can start to work to interrupt this trajectory of health risk behaviors, consequences of that, and then the early death or incarceration. And it also really empowered us to be able to use the language of considering trauma as a public health issue. So it's movie day. I have a couple of movies for you guys today. But I'm going to show just a quick video, and what I'd like you to do is just notice what you see. Some of you have probably seen it before, but again, one of those things that every time I see it, I notice something different or something sticks out. So if you'd like to, just take a note or two of what sticks out, and we'll have a little conversation about this after.
What does your parents' divorce have to do with your risk for heart disease? If your mother had a drinking problem when you were growing up, are you more likely to suffer from depression as an adult? Here's what you should know about ACEs. ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences, extremely stressful events that can happen to a child growing up. Some experiences are so stressful that they can alter brain development, as well as the immune system, increasing the risk of lifelong health and social problems in adulthood. The term comes from the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, landmark research that shed new light on the root cause of everything from stroke and liver disease to substance abuse and mental illness. In the late 1990s, an epidemiologist from the Centers for Disease Control and a preventive medicine doctor at Kaiser Permanente set out to understand the association between childhood experience and lifelong health. They asked over 17,000 people in the Kaiser Health Plan in San Diego about their health history, as well as difficult questions about their experiences growing up. Tallied up 10 different kinds of adversity in this largely middle-class and college-educated population. They were stunned to see how common ACEs were. 21% of all respondents were sexually abused as children. 19% grew up with someone who suffered mental illness. 28% had been physically abused. And 2 out of 3 respondents had experienced at least one ACE. The researchers next looked at how someone's ACE score, or the number of adversities they experienced, related to a wide array of serious health and social problems. They saw that the more ACEs someone had, the greater their risk for poor outcomes compared with someone with no ACEs. Someone with an ACE score of 4 had twice the risk of heart disease and cancer. Someone with an ACE score of 5 had an 8 times greater chance of being an alcoholic. And those with an ACE score of 6 or more, on average, died 20 years earlier. With every major problem they looked at in the ACE study, the risk went up for each additional adverse experience in childhood. As Dr. Robert Anda says, what's predictable is preventable. It's important to remember that ACEs are not destiny. ACEs are a tool for understanding the health of a population as a whole. For individuals, an ACE score can be a tool for understanding their own risk for health and social problems and empower them to make changes for themselves and their children. ACEs tend to get passed down from generation to generation and are common across all income levels, races, and cultures. But increasingly, people of all different professions and backgrounds are coming together to discuss how ACEs affect their communities. They're finding new ways to treat and prevent ACEs. Many doctors are starting to screen their patients for ACEs as part of their medical history. More schools are becoming trauma-informed, considering the source of problem behavior when disciplining their students instead of immediately suspending or expelling them. To learn more about interrupting the cycle of adversity and improving health and well-being for the next generation, please visit kpjrfilms.co.
Okay, there's another movie a little bit later, so don't worry. But what stuck out? Did anything stick out? Please.
Like the ACEs is not destiny.
Yeah, that's such an important part. ACEs is not destiny, right? This is not a diagnosis. If someone comes into my office and we do the ACEs questionnaire, I don't say, oh, well, you've got a 6. There's not much I get, right? It's a tool. We use it for gaining some understanding and really evaluating, am I taking the appropriate approach in working with this person? It's one of many tools, but I love always starting off with this in this foundational understanding because this was really one of those groundbreaking studies that helped us to do that and understand this. Great, thank you. It's not a diagnosis. Yeah, anything else? Please.
What's predictable is preventable or treatable.
Yeah, what's predictable is preventable. I share with people, my ACE score puts me in the category where I'm at risk for experiencing some of those problems that they talk about in a higher rate. And the way that I think about it is, okay, well, that's something that I need to be aware of. Just like my husband and his family, there's a family history of diabetes, so he has to work to prevent that, right? So if I know that now, maybe there are some things that I can do if I'm healthy and exercise and take care of myself and am aware of the things that I'm doing, that I might be able to curb some of those things if I'm holding that in my awareness. Yes, thank you. Please.
So I teach at UVU and I teach positive psychology.
Great.
And I had a student, I have them take the ACE survey.
Good.
And I had a student who had the highest score of a 10. I've never seen that
Mm.
before. But she's a college student
Yeah.
And we focused on her resilience, we focused on her strengths, and how she's overcoming it. And I actually believe post-traumatic growth is more common than post-traumatic stress disorder based on the research in positive psychology.
I love positive psychology, and that's an interesting thing. I'm going to check it out. But yeah, we know that, like I said earlier, my ACE score is pretty high. It puts me in that higher risk category. But also my resilience is pretty high because arguably most of the time I'm functioning pretty well, right? Like I showered before I came to see you guys today. So there are some things, going back to what someone said earlier too about it's predictable, we can also work to balance some of that stuff out, which is a piece where I recognize how fortunate I've been to have some other things in my life that balance those things out. Yes, please.
I was just going to say, if you pair it with the benevolent childhood experiences questionnaire, it really helps see how some people can be more resilient.
Sure.
Because they might have a trillion of these ACEs.
Yeah.
They might also have some really good connections that
Mm-hmm.
could have helped them.
Totally, yeah. So measuring some of these resiliency factors or protective factors, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but that's a really good reason why it's so important when we think about trauma-informed care, because when I think about us as people in helping professions, we have the ability to help the people that we're working with cultivate that resilience or bolster it. So we're really important. Not to toot our horns or anything, but we're important people. So this is a little confusing on the left side, so I'll help. But really what the ACEs study helped us to do was to fill out the rest of this pyramid. Right now we can look at this and say, there's some adverse childhood experiences that might be contributing to why these things are happening, right? Why we're seeing those top 3 parts of the pyramid that we talked about earlier. One of my biggest pieces of training, biggest lessons that I hold on to from working in research was that the understanding that people don't do things for no reason, right? People are doing things for a reason. So if we operate from that perspective, why is that, right? Why would someone be engaging in some of those things? So, and it also, instead of those health risk behaviors, right, allows us to start to conceptualize some of these things as, could they also be coping strategies? Maybe maladaptive coping strategies, sure. But are they negotiating something? Is that where the why exists? So it really allowed us to start to evaluate how we're working with people and understanding why, right? I kind of think about it, I left a garden at my house, and I probably need to hire Brent's neighborhood kids to come over and do some weeding. But thinking about that idea, like if I just go around and I chop the tops off all of the weeds, what's going to happen, right? They're going to come right back. Next week, I'm going to have to pay these kids way more money. And I'm a social worker, so I probably can't afford it. But this kind of allows us to, okay, can we maybe start to pull out some of these roots a little bit? And then will that shift how we see the rest of this happening? And so this is when I think about the why, right? There's lots of research now coming out about trauma, which is amazing. There are expanded versions of this ACEs triangle, which you've probably seen, that also include disrupted neurodevelopment. They also include historical trauma or systemic trauma. But thinking just about this for today, for the basic understanding of this is the why. This is why we're starting to really see these huge movements in trauma-informed care that we are. And so we're going to just look at this. I don't know, I've shown this slide probably 500 times at this point, and every time I look at it, I still am a little bit taken aback, right? These risk factors. I spoke with Dr. Folletti at a conference for a couple of conferences last year, and we were talking one night, and he said, I was embarrassed when these correlations came out, because I thought I must have messed something up, I didn't want to present them. And because typically in research we don't see such strong correlations in things. They just don't exist that way. And over so many different areas, it just doesn't, it's not a normal thing for us to see. And he talked about, he said, I thought I was going to be rich because I had figured out how to help people lose weight in this clinical weight loss clinic that he was working in. And he said everyone lost weight, it was perfect, I thought I was going to be rich. And then people were coming back and they had put on the same amount of weight, if not more, and I had to figure out why. And so as he's having some of those clinical interviews with his patients, he started to hear some of these stories come up. And he started to recognize this pattern emerging. And Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, she's a very powerful figure in this ACEs movement and trauma-informed care movement. She was in the video, but she says, if you have a kid come back from the well and he's sick and you write him a prescription, right? And every time he goes to that well, do you keep writing that prescription, or do you ask at some point what's happening in that well? Right? So thinking back to that idea of how are we negotiating this? And just these bell curves, right? This dose effect that we see as ACEs go up, so do these risk factors for developing some of these things. So that's alcoholism, here's depression, women higher risk than men in that. And then we also know that these can be intergenerational, right? So that we can see these ACEs present in multiple generations. Thinking back in my family history, okay, I know what my ACE is. Thinking about what I know about my parents, I can see that intergenerational link, right? There are different variables that might contribute to this. But this also gives us an understanding of where do we have that ability and opportunity to start to interrupt this cycle. So Wendy mentioned earlier what I do. One of the things that I do is I work with the Social Research Institute. The way that I got into that was when I was in graduate school. And I got a job there as a research assistant. And I thought, yes, I'm getting a tuition waiver. I'm going to get paid, right? This is going to be great. Well, it changed everything for me. So I was working with a professor there at the Social Research Institute. Her name is Dr. Mary Beth Vogel-Ferguson, and she is a brilliant woman, and she was conducting a study evaluating public benefit systems, FEP, which is Family Employment Program, and other public services for DWS. And so what we were doing, we had a pool of 1,000 people around the state, and we were going around the state talking to people who were receiving these public benefits, and we were asking them about, hey, what's it like to work with DWS? How do you feel like they treat you, right? We had a huge instrument evaluating this program. And one of the things that we included was the ACE questionnaire. So we asked this to 1,000 people around the state receiving public benefits. So I'm just going to explain this a little bit. In the blue, on the left-hand side, that's the general Utah ACE score. This is from Brent's people in 2013. Right? So this is, you can see how the distribution of this is. Right? 0, 41%, 1 to 4, 41%, or excuse me, 48%. 5 plus, 10%. That's pretty in line with the general data that came out of the original ACEs research. So the yellow bar, those are the people that we spoke to who were receiving cash benefits around the state, who were receiving this support from DWS. What stands out to you when you see that, those numbers? They're a lot higher. Yeah. They're actually completely inversed on these two edges, right? So almost completely opposite, really close to that. right? So when I look at that, what I think is, wow, it makes sense that maybe these people who we were talking to needed a little bit more support. Maybe there's a reason that they were in some of the programs that they were gaining that support from, right? So who's working in a similar program where you're offering some type of support to someone? Just this guy. Thanks for coming. Just kidding.
So does this say something about poverty?
I mean, it could. It could. I mean, it's interesting. So when we talk about this at the Social Research Institute, one of the conversations that we've had is about how poverty in itself is not necessarily traumatic, but that it can have those negative impacts in work, performance, ability, those kind of things. So maybe related the other way, right? So if my functioning is impacted, I might make less money, but the poverty itself not necessarily. But yeah, interesting, right? So one of the things that I liked about sharing this information was that, I have worked in lots of service organizations where I bet that the numbers of the people that I worked with were probably pretty similar. I don't think that that's a huge jump for us to make. So one of the things after we finished doing this study, we took this stuff to DWS and we started to explain to them, hey, this is what ACEs mean, this is what's going on. And they said, we have to train our people. They have to know what we're dealing with. And at the, for social workers, we were like, yes, they do, please. So they put together a training. And we did about 70 trainings around the state. They were for all DWS employees because we started to explain that, in a really trauma-informed organization, everyone from administrative staff to administration is trained in this understanding. So they said, yeah, okay, you're right, we should train everyone, and we should make it open to everyone in the community, so whoever wants to come can come. So we put together this training, and we offered it to anyone who wanted to come, and we trained over those 3,000 people. And one of the other things that we did in the trainings, because of course research, right, we're always trying to collect research, we gave the ACEs questionnaire in those studies, or in those trainings too. So in the red, those were the people who came to the trainings. What do you see about that one? What sticks out in that one? Those are all people that came from helping organizations and various helping fields, different scopes of work. Notice anything in that? One of the trainings that I was at, because we would do like a live poll and put our group statistics up right then, and I said, what do you guys see in this? This is our group. These are our ACE scores. And one guy, he raised his hand and he said, well, we got issues. I'm like, yeah, we do, right? We do. We've got issues, which is an important part of us becoming trauma-informed, is that we're recognizing we've got our own stuff that we're bringing to the table too. The people that we're working with also, right? That we can really start to negotiate what is this difference of the people that I'm working with and what makes us different. And right, so going back to what I said earlier, like I know that I've got some resiliency. When I look at this and I look at the ACE scores that we collected over the last year or so, that also tells me that there's a lot of resiliency in these rooms, in these seminars, right? And this is about recognizing also what things help to balance out some of my history, if I have it, and how can I help create that in the people that I'm working with as well, right? Because we've got it. And I hope you guys shower today too for the sakes of your neighbors. So this is the why. This is why it's important for us to do trauma-informed care, because this stuff is here in our community, going back to the information from the study. That was done in a middle-class neighborhood in San Diego at Kaiser Permanente, where people have access to health care. Right, and we saw the numbers that we did. That means that this is not something that discriminates us. or discriminates against different groups amongst us. So it's a really important thing for us to be considering. And if we start to work in a way that is trauma-informed, for the people who haven't experienced trauma, it's not going to hurt them, right? At worst, they'll walk away and they'll say, wow, Wendy was really nice. That's amazing. I have to go back there, right? So it won't necessarily even hurt us to start to work in a way that includes some universal precautions. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff coming out about what is trauma-informed care, what does it look like, how do we start to actually do that? So we're going to do a pretty broad overview of some of the different principles of trauma-informed care. And then I've got a list of some more specific things, but we're going to talk about some of what trauma-informed care actually looks like. And Wendy has talked a lot about National Childhood Traumatic Stress Network. And we're going to start off with their 12 core principles of trauma-informed care. So getting going with that, first, that trauma is complex. Right? My mentor at the Social Research Institute, she said, don't you dare say that social workers are bad at math. We're good at math, right? That's part of where the data comes from. But, there are a lot of moving parts in trauma, especially when we start to look at complex trauma. And there's a lot going on. So I loved what Dr. Keeshan said earlier about having some humility of there's probably things that I don't even understand about some of the people that I work with. But I will try to make myself as humble so that I can start to navigate some of this complexity. So that's number one. We're just going to kind of cruise through some of these. Life experiences. So we all bring different perspectives to the table, right? I liked this graphic because, at least for me, when I looked at it, it was like, this kid, he's going for the walk. He's out of here, right? The other kid's like, I don't know. That's my own narrative, right? So, but we all have the idea of what's dangerous, what's safe, right? What's going on around us. Those can be internal and external indicators or cues that we get from the environment around us or how we perceive the things that we do. Going back to that idea of what our ACEs look like. Are there reasons that we perceive things the way that we do? Okay, reminders and adversities. Dr. Keeshan touched on this a little bit earlier too. But there's often a secondary adversity for children after they've experienced trauma, right? So in a situation, just as an example, say they lose their parents due to incarceration. Brent mentioned these 3 areas of the ACEs, right? That they fall under typically: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So, for example, a kid goes through some type of abuse, and then the parent is incarcerated, and then they're placed in foster care. And then, right, so it's interesting because often with the clients that I work with, sometimes it's not even necessarily that something happened that reminds them of their trauma specifically or their traumatic experience specifically, but it's this new situation of, oh, well, now I have these new adopted parents, and the relationship is kind of difficult sometimes. And that reminds me of all of the other stuff too, right? So there can sometimes also be situations where, we having experienced trauma puts us at risk for experiencing more trauma. So in the ACEs research, they talk about if you've got one, you're over 80% more likely to have another. And there are different variables that can contribute to that too. But those are important things for us to consider too. And also thinking about what prompts some of that trauma response in the people that we work with. It's amazing sometimes the spectrum of how I can see that vacillate in people, and I'm always often surprised. We can plan our best to try to avoid triggering others, but we can't always do it. So that there's wide-ranging reactions. This is something that I use very often in clinical practice when I'm talking to people about how their trauma response might present. This is called the window of tolerance. Is anybody familiar with it? Cool, good, like half. So I'll just explain it really briefly, but you can also Google it. It's very easily accessible. This comes out of polyvagal theory. But on the left-hand side, I'll read it just briefly to explain it. There's something that happens that pulls up that trauma response. So this is for stress and anxiety and trauma response related responses. And that kicks us up into hyperarousal, or that can kick us down into hypoarousal. Hyperarousal, we can see the outburst, the rigidity. I've worked with some mothers who, like, I can only have this one person take care of my children, no one else, right? So maybe we see some of these things manifest in different ways. Addictions, impulsivity, overeating, restricting, obsessive compulsive thoughts, anxiety, outbursts, anger, right? Or hypoarousal. This one is a little bit trickier to notice. This is kind of like, this person is sitting in front of me and they're maybe nodding their head or they're saying yes, but I don't feel like anybody's in there. I think sometimes about this one, have you guys seen the fainting goats video? Right, so other animals do this too. They're fainting goats or possum, right? That expression, oh, you're just playing possum? That's hypoarousal, right? That's a survival mechanism. And that's really what some of these things are when we think about trauma responses being normal responses to abnormal events. These are responses that are intended to keep us safe and protect us, right? If I make myself really small, maybe there's a better chance that I'll stay out of the way and no one will notice that I'm here. Right, so these things can be protective for us. One of the ways that I will check to see if someone's in hypoarousal, if I have an inkling of it, I'll say, oh, sometimes I talk a lot, I don't always make that much sense. I want to make sure I made sense. Will you tell me what I just said? I want to make sure it made sense. Right, if they say, I don't know, right, or I'm not sure, that's a pretty good indicator. Maybe they're in that hypoarousal. So I'm going to ask you guys that later. What I say earlier, and see what happens. But that can be a little bit trickier to notice. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next one. But because this is, you guys have been sitting here for a little bit, I'm gonna have this slide, be a little bit more experiential. Okay, so. Just a warning, I put this in here, this is my own bias, but snakes freak me out. So I'm going to share that with you guys, okay? We're just going to take a minute to see this. Oh. It's moving on this side. Yeah. It's frozen on that side.
We froze.
Yeah, you guys are in hypoarousal and it's contagious. Yeah. Okay. We'll give it another try, and if not, we'll keep it moving. It's not coming, huh? Okay, well maybe we'll figure it out after.
Try it from there, see if it'll play out directly out. Oh, but that's not, okay.
We must have to switch it somehow. But anyways, okay, so here's what we'll do. I'll tell you guys and then I'll show it to you later if you want to stick around. So, I love this video because it says this is the largest dead snake ever found, right? In 18 seconds, this snake is going to show you that it's very much alive still. And it brings up some fear, right? I showed it at another conference a couple weeks ago, and people screamed. It was great. So I was really hoping for that to happen again tonight, but maybe later. Yeah, you're off the hook. Right. So really what this illustrates is this next idea of danger and safety, right? There are some things that are supposed to be a certain way. So when we learn that it's not, that example of the dead snake that ends up jumping out of the screen, just pretend like you saw it, right? That jumps out at the screen, you said, well, if you told me it was a dead snake, right? This was supposed to be a safe thing. And then the next time that someone tried to show you a dead snake, you'd remember, you'd say, well, Kara tried to show us a video of a dead snake and it wasn't dead and it scared us and we screamed and that was horrible, so I don't think I trust that, right? So it can change our experience of what's dangerous and what is safe. If I go to a place that is supposed to be safe and it's not, that might change my perception of what a safe place is. That umbrella, right? It's a little less scary than the snake, but thinking about the caregiving systems, right? This one's interesting too because this is challenging for us, and I think this is great. Everyone is starting to learn about trauma-informed care and really staying on top of information and present with all of these things. And someone mentioned earlier, it wasn't always this way. So there's a challenge in us noticing some of this stuff and responding to it in a trauma-informed way. It's also, it can also be a very challenging population to work with. There are some people that I'm working with that will probably be with me for an extended period of time because their trauma has been so complex. And I always tell my clients, hey, I'm trying to work myself out of a job, but I'm here as long as you need me. So that just depends on how we work through things. But caregiving systems, this is also a good thing for us to evaluate. Who are the caregiving systems who are around in this person's life? Right? Are they faith communities, family members, social communities? Is there a mentor at school or someone? Right? Has anybody heard of Oprah? Yeah. So, some people know about her, but she talks pretty openly about her history, and there's a beautiful video. She just did a 60-minute segment on ACEs and trauma, and there's a beautiful after the interview, if anyone hasn't seen it, that I really like, and she talks about what her biggest protective factor, resiliency factor was. And it was a teacher. It was just a person that she saw that she felt she really knew believed in her. Right? So thinking about that, how are the caregiving systems also responding? But that can be another piece, or that secondary adversity that we talked about. If I go and report something to someone and I'm treated poorly, or I'm blamed for that experience, or there are lots of things that can happen, then that might impact some of that experience as well. And then evaluating, are there protective and promotive factors? So when I think about this resiliency piece, right, so we know that there's trauma in the room. We also know that there's resiliency in the room because we're doing okay. I think about this balance, right? So are we doing some things that are supporting us being able to negotiate some of these things? Do I have some supports to be able to do that? Also, resiliency is something that we can build and increase. So if someone comes in and they say, I went through all this stuff and I really don't have anybody, and I don't have, any other supports, and we can't identify some of those things, I'm going to work for us to do that first before we go into some of their trauma work, to make sure that if we go into their trauma work, it can be something that's negotiable. Right? So we always want to balance some of that. And for those of you who are trauma trained, we call that resourcing. We want to make sure that there's some resources available. Development, who's seen this picture before? Okay, good. So a handful. So I'm going to just explain this a little bit. On the left-hand side, we've got a healthy baby brain. On the right-hand side, we've got an abused baby brain. Oh, there's a pointer. Okay, good. So down here, this is where we've got some of this activity coming from where trauma response happens in our brain. Red is the most active. Black is the least active. Okay, so same area over here on this side. And what happens, because we're wired above all else for survival, is if something comes up, and what Bessel van der Kolk calls in that limbic system the smoke alarm, if that smoke alarm goes off, then we make sure that we conserve all energy. We go into that hyper or hypoarousal. We can, right? And what we're trying to do is protect ourselves. That's not always the place that we're doing our best thinking from. So neocortex, right, is this part of our brain where executive functioning lives. For us, multitasking, problem solving, interpersonal relationships, all of that good stuff, right? But if that gets hijacked by us making sure that we are surviving, then we're probably not doing things in a way that actually would be the most helpful for us. There's a possibility for that. So thinking about that, who's ever done something that they've regretted when they were angry? Yeah, a few of us, right? And we look back on that. I've never done that, but when you guys have done that, you've looked back on it and you've said, I can't believe I did that. What was I thinking? Well, maybe technically you weren't, right? But one of the things that they talk about, this is where the more ACEs matter, is that if I'm consistently in this state, right, through all of those important developmental stages, then I might be missing out on some of that important development. If I'm focused on survival, I might not be reaching some of those milestones that I would otherwise. So that's why we might see some of the people that we work with who present as if they're in different developmental stages. So it's important to note also that black area on the right-hand side is not missing, right? It's not gone. I kind of think about it like if I cross my legs for too long and my leg falls asleep, right? My leg doesn't fall off. It's just not working in the same way. So that's the important part about more matters. And also, if we see someone who is activated by their trauma response, depending on when the trauma happened, we might see some more behaviors associated with that developmental age stage or what was happening for them. So thinking about that reptilian complex, that is the automatic part of our brain that is wired for survival. It's always taking in information, right? It walks into a room. When I walked into this room, I said, oh, okay. It feels pretty nice in here. It seems safe, seems okay. The chairs look comfortable, right? If I would have walked into this room and there's like a snarling bear down here on the stage, right? Something different probably would have happened in my brain. We might have seen some of that stress response kick in. If that would have happened, this reptilian part of the brain would have sent that information up to the limbic system and said, hey, turn on that smoke alarm. It's time to get out of here, right? Again, that neocortex part of my brain where like conflict resolution and all that stuff lives, I don't need that as much, right? I'm not going to sit down and have like a healthy conflict resolution with a snarling bear, right? So I probably actually don't need that. So my brain is doing what it needs to do to make sure that I'm safe. I'm probably going to run. That's my best chance, honestly, guys. Who can fight a bear, right? So if that happens, that's what we're seeing. Those are the areas that we're seeing impacted by trauma response in the brain. So also that we're thinking about culture right? What are people interpreting their experiences to mean? There are some things, I work with some people of refugee background. There are some things that they experience as traumatic that maybe we wouldn't, and vice versa. So just depending on cultural differences. Also, a really important opportunity for us to examine routes to healing, because there may be some ideas, some practices, some different options in someone else's culture that are relative to them in their experience, thinking back to that idea of life experience, that can be helpful in healing. Social contract. I found this drawing. Brent did it. Just kidding. But, there's this idea of the social contract. I'm supposed to be a pretty good citizen, and the government's supposed to help me out or look after me. Sometimes in some people's trauma experiences, that social contract is broken, so they may be very hesitant to come to us for support. I've worked with some people that, it's 6 months, a year into working together, that they say, okay, Kara, there's something that I need to tell you. And they tell me something that is huge. Right? Like there's maybe something good for us to talk about on the first day, but that makes sense because of what happened. I know it's hard for you to trust someone. Right? So thinking about some of those social contracts. Trauma-informed organizations make sure to acknowledge that there is a tax for us in working in trauma-exposed fields. That can put us at risk for secondary trauma. One of the biggest risk factors for secondary trauma is that we have trauma ourselves. We know that we do. We've seen the ACE scores. So that's an important thing for us to be aware of. If your organization is not trauma-informed as a whole, how can you start doing it for yourself? That's so important for sustainability. I know a lot of really good social workers who have become real estate agents. I'm like, guys, we need you, So those are the 12 core principles from NCTSN. Here's some information from SAMHSA. These are their 6 key principles of trauma-informed care. So I'm just going to show you some different information so you can see how some of these overlap. Right? We've got cultural, historical, gender issues, safety, transparency and trustworthiness, empowerment, voice and choice, collaboration and mutuality, and peer support. So the principles of trauma-informed organizations exist on both sides of the organization, for the people that we serve and for us too. These are the 4 R's, right? There's lots of acronyms and little kind of things to help us remember. But the 4 R's of trauma-informed care that we realize, that we recognize, that we respond, and that we resist re-traumatization. Right? So we're working to trying to do that, right? We're working on this realization now. We're talking about trauma-informed care. We're learning about how to recognize it in the people that we work with and how to respond. There are some really effective therapies for trauma resolution. And so here's some more of these key principles. These are from NCTSN also, the supervision, right? So that we've got supervision, trauma-informed training, organizational support, balance, consistent self-care, administrative support. So these are things that in a fully trauma-informed organization we've got, right? Sometimes I put some of this information up and they say, how are we going to do that? That's going to take a lot of resources. This is something that exists over time. Guys, system change takes a lot of time and it takes work. I've been working specifically to specialize in trauma for, 5 years now, maybe? Yeah, so going back to some social workers aren't good at math, right? But, and I'm still very aware that I've got a lot to learn, right? So these are 16 steps to creating a trauma-informed organization. So this is a little bit more brass tacks. This comes out of SAMHSA's tip 57, that we've got commitment to trauma-informed care, that we use trauma-informed principles and strategic planning, review our mission statements and vision statements and values, assign key staff members to facilitate change, create trauma-informed oversight committees. Sometimes that is helpful, right, to have some people who are working to implement this, have that implementation plan, conduct organizational self-assessment. There are lots of really good organizational assessments out there for trauma-informed care, like the organizational toolkit, but there are a number of them that are really good ones. Develop our policies and procedures. Disaster plans incorporate universal routine screenings, apply cultural responsive principles, use science-based knowledge, create peer support environments, obtain ongoing feedback and evaluations, change the environment to increase safety, and develop trauma-informed collaborations. This is one of the biggest things that I think is so important, that we do not work in trauma-exposed fields on our own. It's impossible. It is so hard to do that. Everyone has been talking about this today, about how do we collaborate? How do we have multidisciplinary teams? I work in a group practice, but I know other providers in the community that I know are trauma-informed. So if someone comes in to see me and they've got some stuff going on, I say, oh, I know this really great endocrinologist. Maybe give them a call, see what they think. And I can coordinate care with those other providers that I know what's going on. Or at least that I know that they got over to the person that I want them to be with. So again, these are things that take some time and take some work. But definitely doing that as a collaborative effort. You made it, guys. You didn't even have to watch the snake video. I know we literally have a minute, but I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts. Please.
All morning I've been thinking about what we're doing for the children on the border.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thinking about the children on the border.
They're already traumatized.
Yeah, yes. That is a really hard thing to think about. Definitely. Which is, I don't think that our president has come to any of my lectures yet. Yeah. Any others? I'll be around if you'd like to come and ask me any questions. I'm happy to talk.